The moment is here, you can stop your search. It's Comics by Perch.
Hey everybody, this is Perch. A lack of high-profile comics talent. All right. By the way, like so many emails and so many topics, I've complained about this. In general, in comics, there's just too many landmines around what seems like every single topic. If you criticize the wrong comic, whether it's Hawkgirl, whether it's Cyberfrog, you're going to have people who are going to have a knee-jerk reaction to your critique. By the way, the same goes for the other direction. If you compliment it, you're going to have the same thing. And people are going to load in the bucket of everything with every stereotype that goes into every book. That's the challenge that we have here in comics. And if you think about it, nearly every topic is this way. If you say, I prefer old comics, well, then you're clearly a Nazi. If you say, hey, the current comic talent doesn't have the same profile as the comic talent during the 90s. Well, here's the thing. That is, objectively true. Because the words matter. High profile means recognizable, names that everyone knows. And the reality is, back during the 90s, you had Wizard Magazine, you had the newsstand, you had all these other factors where you had Rob Liefeld advertising jeans. That's a bigger platform and a bigger vehicle for comic talent to be recognized. It's a fact. And yet, if you say that out loud, we're going to read this mail, but if you say it out loud, then somehow it's like, well, that must mean that, again, you're Hitler. Because, if you're complaining about high-profile comic style, that certainly means that you're making fun of marginalized people and black and brown people and on and on and on it goes. When it is a objective fact, there are not nearly as many high-profile comic names that are known as there today as there were, by the sheer nature of where the industry's at. Forget about talent. Forget about that for a moment. It's just that's where things are. And so you wind up having to, a lot of really stupid arguments take place versus solutions because nobody will have the conversation around it. Again, try having a conversation about comics in their current state with Heidi McDonald. You cannot. It is impossible. Unless the conversation is everything is good except the people over there are the bad guys over there, those are the bad guys. There's not a deeper conversation you can have. And by the way, I just mentioned a quote-unquote comic journalist. Like, if you can't have a objective conversation with a journalist, then what the hell? You're very broken at that point. But let's see what this person says. This says, hey, Perch. I was looking at Marvel solicitations recently, and as I was reading the talent on the books, I kept asking myself, who? It's sad when the variant cover artist is the only well-known talent on the comic. Thinking back 10 years ago, we had Rick Remender, Ed Brubaker, Matt Fraction, and others working on high-profile titles. And when they left Marvel, they never went back. It's not as bad with DC, but I think Scott Snyder is done with them. I do not. Anyway, and whatever happened to Greg Rucka and Judd Winick? These guys were at the top of DC not that long ago. So what's running talent off? Do you think they are deprioritized by the big two when they reach a certain level? Just recently, I read that Rick Remender turned down Batman and X-Men in favor of doing his own independent work, which is mind-blowing because just 10 to 15 years ago, people would have killed to get those gigs. As I'm writing this, I'm seeing the news of Jeff Johns, Gary Frank, and others forming their own imprint at Image. In fairness, I thought Jeff Johns already had. I saw that news too coming out of New York City Comic Con, and I'm like, did the Ghost Machine, didn't they already have? I thought they had this already. Anyway, several people did. There were a lot of announcements around little imprints going on. So I wonder if top talents are just fed up with working with Marvel and DC, and they'd rather go independent despite the struggle. But I believe they need each other. The big franchises need top talent, and the top talent need to work on the big franchises where their work will reach a bigger audience. I'm a big fan of Ed Brubaker's indie work, but let's be honest, none of it has the same attention as his Captain America run. So I'll pause here for a moment. The factor for a lot of writers is like, hey, I can own my own IP. So if it ever gets optioned off and there's a TV show, then I control the rights. I make all the money. That's factor number one, and that's huge for a lot of artists and creators. And the second is, in many cases, the pay gets to be equivalent, or maybe not quite as good, but almost as good. And then but plus you're in charge of your own destiny. I mean, that the big factor here is just the pay at the big two sucks. And so if you're a big name, two things happen. One, you quickly realize you can make the same money on your own and potentially have the upside of a deal. And two, the big two start deprioritizing you in many cases because they don't have the budget to pay. So, it's like, why would I want to worry about all the minutia and the editorial kind of craziness and nonsense, people not getting back to me and having to fight people to read an email and all that kind of stuff to get, in effect, the exact same money I would make if I was just on my own and I can work at my own speed. Now, working on your own requires discipline, and Brubaker is a good example of somebody who puts in the work and, he gets stuff done and he's disciplined about it. He hustles. And so it works. If for some people though, and I'll give an example, I think Dan Slott, based on what we've seen, if he was to leave Marvel and go independent, I think he would, for the sheer factor of he seems to require a lot of nudging along, be it Brevoort or the editor or Christos Gage writing for him or whatever it happens to be. He needs that additional support or he starts missing deadlines. He gets obsessed with Twitter or whatever it might be. There's a lot of creators out there who, I'm speculating, Kelly Sue, Bad Fraction, Gail Simone, others who are very active, on social media, and some of them, not all of the Fraction side, but they become very active there and they actually do less work. And so if you're going to be your own boss, you need to, be your own boss. You need to hold yourself to a schedule. And I think that's challenging for a lot of creators. So I think the big two can give people the framework and the support to, get stuff done. And when you don't have that, it's you can make a lot of money if you're self-motivated, but if you're not, it can be a curse. Anyway, back to the mail. It says, also, if I'm one of these writers, I wouldn't want to give Marvel and DC my best ideas. Yeah, that's a big factor. I'll lose ownership of it. If it becomes a big hit movie, I'll get chump change of a royalty check that I'll have to fight for. Yeah, I mean, Marvel Studios trying to remember if they need to pay Jim Starlin is somewhat embarrassing. And by somewhat embarrassing, I mean completely and terribly embarrassing and awful and rotten human beings. But anyway. Meanwhile, there's always somebody willing to work for peanuts, so they could just work for Marvel to show off to their friends on Twitter, and it just devalues all talents. So none of this is good long-term for anybody. What do you think about this, Perch? How would you attribute the current lack of talent to, and what would you do to remedy it? I apologize for these long emails of mine. I'm sure you know what to expect from me by now. Hopefully, if I did his job, guess it is. And I'd love to see this. This gentleman has sent in logos in the past, which is pretty awesome. So, I mean, in general, yeah, I think you have a high-profile talent problem for sure. And I think the challenge that you got is that it on one hand, you don't have the infrastructure I mentioned. There's no Wizard magazine. There's no, credible journalist who's doing like top 10 lists of creators. A lot of the people doing quote unquote comics journalism shill for their friends and only their friends, and they over-index on it. And there's not a true like top 10 writers, top 10 artists that you had in the past. You don't have the interesting comics where Levi's is not, coming around asking Tom King to do an interview or a commercial. And, unfortunately, my opinion is the stunts that they've done, hey, Superboy is bisexual. That will get you a interview on CNN, and Tom Taylor can go in there and talk about it, but he's not portrayed. I mean, CNN won't promote him as comic book writer who writes lots of comics and creates lots of different worlds. They promote him as guy who turns Superboy bi. That's how they promote it. By the way, which isn't Tom Taylor's fault. It's just if you're going to do a story that's designed to be splashy and it's designed to get media attention, the media attention is going to be for the controversial element of it. It's not going to be for the creators. So all these things mean lower profile. It just means we don't have people coming up. And then, you've made the money so poor that, if you're Ed Brubaker, you're like, well, I can, make $5,000 over here, or I can, do some work at Marvel and maybe make $6,000, but, twice as long to get the money, and it would be painful, and they're going to yell. I mean, like, why would I? It's not worth $1,000. I can do probably 2 books, $5,000 each time, in the span of what Marvel would pay me $6,000 for. So it's just I'm losing money if I keep doing this. Unfortunately, that's the math that a lot of creators are doing. As long as you're having that, then anyone who gets a name is going to go off. Now, I do agree with your point, by the way, that for comic creators, they need the exposure of the big two. If they go too early, and a lot of them do, then they, you get the, Tim Sheridan kind of effect, which is never really broke through, or, Joe Glass, who never, ever broke through. That you have a lot of people who, got just a tiny bit of momentum and then, quickly went and did their own work. Joe Glass is not an example of that because he didn't have that big 2 job. So anyway, but I think if you abandon ship too quickly and you think, well, I've got to, a good example would be Steve Orlando. Now he's kind of returned now to Marvel. He's doing Marvel work, but he went and did that, Commanders in Crisis book at Image after a, fairly well-hailed, very, he got a lot of promotion out of DC. But the problem is that, he didn't have enough of a name. He wasn't a household name yet. He hadn't had the kind of the killer run. He'd been praised by Bleeding Cool and The Beat, but not by actual people who buy comics and read them. And so he didn't have that level. And so he goes and does his Commanders in Crisis, and, his pals shill for him, but it means nothing to the comic store. The amount of comic stores, by the way, who know what Bleeding Cool and The Beat are as sites is less than 25%. I'm not joking. More of the retailers for sure, but the customers, no, not at all. And their money and their advertising will tell you that. So all of this combines means, objectively, there's comic creators have a lower profile now, and it is bad. And if you want this stuff to work, Marvel is going to need to build the next, Image 6 within their company, and they're going to need to, be smarter about being able to keep them, which has a little bit to do with money, but also might have a lot to do with, like, Bob Harris not being an idiot when it comes to managing talent. But anyway, be it as it may. Thank you very much for the mail. What do you all think? Low profile, high profile, how do you fix it? Is it fixable? Is it a problem? Let me know in the comments below, like and subscribe, and thanks for listening.